On a crisp October morning in 2019, the demolition crew arrived at the corner of Main and Elm Street in Youngstown, Ohio. The building they were about to tear down had stood for 127 years. Its Gothic revival spire had watched over 5 generations of weddings, funerals, Christmas pageants, and Sunday morning congregations. But on this particular morning, only 17 people gathered to watch the First Presbyterian Church of Youngstown crumble into dust and memory. The church's final service had been held 3 months earlier with just 9 attendees, all of them over the age of 70. The building that once housed a congregation of 800 now echoed with nothing but the whispers of ghosts and the settling of old wood. As the wrecking ball swung that October morning, it wasn't just demolishing a building. It was erasing a cornerstone of American community life that had endured since before the Civil War. This scene has played out thousands of times across America in recent decades, but most of us never notice. We drive past the empty lots where steeples once pierced the sky, past the former churches now converted into antique shops, yoga studios, and craft breweries. What we're witnessing is perhaps the most profound and underreported transformation in American society: the systematic disappearance of the church from Main Street America. Between 2010 and 2020, America lost an average of one church every day. That's not a typo. 365 churches closed their doors permanently every single year for an entire decade. But here's what makes this statistic even more staggering. During that same period, only about 200 new churches opened annually. We're not just talking about a slowdown in growth. We're witnessing the actual shrinkage of American Christianity for the first time in the nation's history. The numbers tell a story that would have been inconceivable to previous generations. In 1950, nearly 3/4 of Americans claimed membership in a church or synagogue. By 2020, that figure had plummeted to less than half. But membership statistics only scratch the surface. Weekly church attendance, the real measure of religious engagement, has fallen even more dramatically. In the 1950s, 40% of Americans attended religious services weekly. Today, that number hovers around 20%, and among Americans under 30, it's a mere 13%. To understand what this means for America, we need to travel back to a time when the church wasn't just a building on Main Street. It was Main Street. In countless American towns founded between 1800 and 1950, the church wasn't merely the tallest building. It was the beating heart of community life. The spire served as both a literal and metaphorical compass point, visible from miles away, guiding travelers and residents alike to the center of civic engagement. Take Harmony, Pennsylvania, a town of 891 residents about 30 miles north of Pittsburgh. Founded in 1804 by German pietists, Harmony was designed with the church at its literal center. Every street radiated outward from the church square like spokes on a wheel. This wasn't accidental. It reflected a worldview where religious faith anchored every aspect of community life. The church wasn't just where people worshiped on Sundays. It was where they held town meetings, organized disaster relief, celebrated harvests, and gathered during times of crisis. This pattern repeated itself across the American landscape with remarkable consistency. From the Congregational churches of New England to the Baptist churches of the South, from the Lutheran churches of the Midwest to the Catholic churches of immigrant neighborhoods, houses of worship became the de facto community centers of American towns. They hosted everything from school board meetings to amateur theater productions, from vaccination clinics to political debates. But perhaps more importantly, churches served as the social glue that held communities together across lines of class, education, and even political affiliation. In 1950s America, it wasn't uncommon for the bank president and the factory worker, the teacher and the farmer, the Republican and the Democrat, to sit in the same pews every Sunday morning. This weekly ritual of shared worship created bonds that extended far beyond the sanctuary walls, fostering the kind of social cohesion that political scientists now identify as essential for healthy democratic societies. Dr. Robert Putnam, the Harvard political scientist who coined the term social capital, has spent decades studying how Americans connect with each other. His research reveals something remarkable about churches. They were America's largest generators of social capital. Church members weren't just more likely to vote, volunteer, and participate in community organizations. They were dramatically more likely to do so. Even accounting for education, income, and other factors, regular church attendance doubled the likelihood that someone would volunteer for secular causes, join civic organizations, and engage in local politics. Welcome to Professor Archive, where we uncover the hidden stories that shaped our world. I'm curious, where are you watching from today, and what time is it where you are? Are you perhaps taking a break from work, or maybe you're a student diving into some weekend learning? Drop a comment and let me know. I love hearing from viewers around the globe. And if you find value in these deep dives into history and culture, consider supporting the channel with a super thanks. Every contribution helps us continue bringing you these untold stories. Now, let's return to our investigation of America's disappearing churches and what it means for the fabric of our society. The decline didn't happen overnight. Like many profound social changes, it began almost imperceptibly in the post-World War II era. The first cracks appeared in the 1960s, during a decade of upheaval that challenged virtually every American institution. The Civil Rights Movement exposed the hypocrisy of segregated churches. The Vietnam War created a crisis of moral authority for religious leaders who either supported an unpopular war or seemed irrelevant to the great moral questions of the day. The sexual revolution challenged traditional religious teachings about family and morality. But perhaps the most significant factor was one that few predicted: prosperity. The post-war economic boom that created suburban America also began to loosen the bonds that tied people to their local churches. Suddenly, Americans had options their grandparents never dreamed of. Sunday morning could be spent at the lake, the golf course, or the shopping mall instead of in a pew. The automobile made it possible to live miles from where you worked, shopped, and worshipped, breaking down the geographic communities that had sustained churches for generations. The data from this period tells a fascinating story. In 1965, 70% of Americans told pollsters that religion was very important in their lives. By 1978, that figure had dropped to 52%. Church attendance followed a similar trajectory, declining steadily throughout the 1970s and 1980s. But what's particularly striking is that this decline accelerated rather than leveled off. Each subsequent generation proved less religious than the one before it. Consider the generational divide that exists today. Among Americans born before 1945, the so-called silent generation, 67% still consider themselves religious. Among Generation X, born between 1965 and 1980, that figure drops to 58%. But among millennials born after 1980, only 49% identify as religious, and among Generation Z, the oldest of whom are now in their mid-20s, the number plummets to just 42%. These aren't just abstract statistics. They represent a fundamental shift in how Americans understand themselves and their relationship to their communities. Dr. Grace Davey, a sociologist at the University of Exeter who studies religion in modern societies, describes this phenomenon as believing without belonging. Many Americans, particularly younger ones, maintain some form of spiritual belief while rejecting organized religion and institutional churches. This distinction is crucial for understanding what's happening on Main Street America. The churches that are closing aren't necessarily losing members because people have lost faith entirely. Often they're losing members because people have lost faith in institutions. Not just religious institutions, but all institutions. This is part of a broader pattern of declining trust in government, media, corporations, and other traditional authority structures that has been documented by researchers for decades. The COVID-19 pandemic accelerated these trends in ways that are still being measured. When churches were forced to close their doors in March 2020, many discovered that their congregations didn't return when restrictions lifted. A 2022 study by the Faith Communities Today research project found that the median American church lost 18% of its congregation during the pandemic years. For many churches that were already struggling with declining membership and aging congregations, this represented a death blow. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. While traditional mainline Protestant churches, Methodist, Presbyterian, Episcopal, and Lutheran congregations that once dominated American main streets, have borne the brunt of the decline, other forms of religious expression have actually grown. Evangelical megachurches, with their contemporary worship styles and extensive programs, have continued to attract members even as smaller churches close. Non-denominational churches, which reject traditional religious hierarchies, have experienced significant growth. And perhaps most surprisingly, some of the fastest-growing religious communities in America are non-Christian. Hindu temples, Buddhist meditation centers, and Islamic mosques. This shift represents more than just changing religious preferences. It reflects the broader transformation of American society from a network of small, tight-knit communities to a more individualized, mobile, and diverse nation. The church that worked for the America of 1950, when the average person lived their entire life within 50 miles of where they were born, may be fundamentally incompatible with the America of 2024, where the average person moves 11 times in their lifetime and maintains relationships across vast geographic distances through digital technology. The economic implications of church closures extend far beyond the congregations themselves. A study by the Georgetown University Public Policy Institute found that American churches contribute over $1 trillion annually to the economy through charitable work, business operations, and community services. When a church closes, it doesn't just eliminate a place of worship. It often eliminates the largest charitable organization in the community. Consider what happened in Flint, Michigan, during the water crisis that began in 2014. While government agencies struggled to respond effectively, local churches immediately mobilized to provide bottled water, food assistance, and emotional support to affected families. The Greater Holy Temple Church alone distributed over 2 million bottles of water in the first year of the crisis. When churches like these close, communities lose not just their spiritual centers, but their disaster response networks, their food banks, their homeless shelters, and their after-school programs. The ripple effects extend into unexpected areas. Real estate values in neighborhoods with active, well-maintained churches tend to be higher than those in neighborhoods where churches have closed or fallen into disrepair. Church buildings, with their unique architecture and large spaces, are notoriously difficult to repurpose or sell. Many former churches sit empty for years, becoming magnets for vandalism and urban decay. Yet some communities have found creative solutions. In Burlington, Vermont, the former St. Paul's Cathedral was transformed into a mixed-use development that includes affordable housing, office space, and a community center. The developers preserved the building's historic architecture while adapting it for modern needs. In Portland, Oregon, the Kennedy School, a former elementary school, was converted into a hotel and entertainment complex that has become a beloved community gathering place. These success stories point to a broader truth. While the institutional church may be disappearing from Main Street, the human need for community, meaning, and connection remains as strong as ever. Americans are simply finding new ways to fulfill these needs. Community gardens, neighborhood associations, hobby clubs, and volunteer organizations are proliferating in many areas where traditional religious institutions have declined. The political implications of this transformation are profound and largely misunderstood. Contrary to popular belief, the decline of religious institutions doesn't necessarily benefit either political party. While it's true that highly religious Americans tend to vote Republican, churches have historically served as crucial spaces for civic engagement across party lines. They provided neutral venues where people with different political views could work together on shared community concerns. Research by political scientists at Duke University found that communities with higher levels of religious participation also tend to have higher levels of civic engagement overall. More voter turnout, more volunteerism, more participation in local government. As religious participation declines, so does civic participation more broadly. This helps explain the growing polarization and decreased civic engagement that characterizes much of contemporary American politics. The regional patterns of church decline tell their own story about American social and economic change. The Northeast and Pacific Coast, regions that experienced early industrialization and urbanization, have seen the steepest declines in religious participation. The South and Midwest, with their more rural populations and stronger traditional cultures, have experienced slower but still significant declines. But even in the Bible Belt, the changes are unmistakable. Mississippi, the most religious state in America, saw church membership drop from 78% in 2008 to 68% in 2020. Perhaps nowhere is this transformation more visible than in the small towns of rural America. These communities, often built around a single industry like farming, manufacturing, or mining, traditionally had churches that served multiple generations of the same families. As young people left for opportunities in larger cities and local economies declined, the churches began to empty. Today, it's not uncommon to find rural churches where the youngest regular attendee is in their 60s. The Reverend Sarah Mitchell knows this reality intimately. She serves 4 different Methodist churches across a 70-mile radius in central Kansas, driving from congregation to congregation every Sunday to lead services for communities that can no longer support their own full-time pastor. Her largest congregation has 37 members. Her smallest has 9. All 4 churches are housed in buildings constructed between 1890 and 1920. Architectural treasures that require constant maintenance, these aging congregations can barely afford. Every Sunday, I see the same faithful faces, Reverend Mitchell explains. They've been coming to these churches their entire lives, as did their parents and grandparents before them. But their children and grandchildren have moved away, and there's no one to replace them. We're literally watching the end of an era. This pattern is repeated across rural America, where small-town churches face a perfect storm of demographic and economic challenges. Young people leave for education and employment opportunities in urban areas. Those who remain often work multiple jobs or irregular schedules that make regular church attendance difficult. The social ties that once bound rural communities together have been weakened by everything from the consolidation of family farms to the closure of local businesses to the arrival of big-box stores that draw shoppers to distant cities. Yet the picture isn't entirely bleak. Some rural churches have found innovative ways to remain relevant and vital. The First Baptist Church of Elkhart, Kansas, population 2,000, has become a regional hub for community services. They operate a food bank that serves 5 counties, a clothing closet, a medical equipment lending library, and a tutoring program for local students. Their Sunday service includes people who drive from as far as 50 miles away, not necessarily for the religious message, but for the sense of community and mutual support. This adaptation reflects a broader trend among surviving churches. The shift from purely religious institutions to community service organizations that happen to have a religious foundation. Many thriving churches today look less like the traditional houses of worship our grandparents knew, and more like comprehensive community centers that offer everything from childcare to senior services, from financial counseling to addiction recovery programs. The megachurch phenomenon represents perhaps the most dramatic evolution in American religious practice. Churches like Lakewood Church in Houston, which attracts over 40,000 worshipers weekly, or North Point Community Church in Atlanta, with its multiple campuses and contemporary worship style, bear little resemblance to the small-town churches that once anchored American communities. These institutions operate more like entertainment venues or corporate campuses than traditional churches, with professional lighting, sound systems, and multimedia presentations. Critics argue that megachurches represent the commercialization and superficialization of American religion, prioritizing spectacle over substance and growth over genuine community. Supporters counter that they're simply adapting ancient traditions to modern sensibilities, using contemporary methods to deliver timeless messages. What's undeniable is that they've been remarkably successful at attracting and retaining members, particularly younger adults who might otherwise have no connection to organized religion. But megachurches, by their very nature, cannot replicate the intimate community connections that characterize traditional Main Street churches. It's impossible to know personally all 40,000 members of Lakewood Church in the way that everyone knew everyone else in the typical small-town congregation of 1950. This represents a fundamental shift in how Americans experience religious community. from intimate, face-to-face relationships within walking distance of home to anonymous participation in large-scale organizations that might be located miles away. The rise of online religious participation, accelerated by the COVID-19 pandemic, represents yet another evolution in American religious practice. Millions of Americans now attend virtual church services, participate in online Bible studies, and maintain religious connections through social media and video conferencing. While this technology makes religious participation more accessible for people with mobility issues, unconventional work schedules, or geographic isolation, it further erodes the physical gathering spaces that once anchored American communities. As we look toward the future, several trends seem likely to accelerate. The generational shift away from organized religion shows no signs of slowing. Younger Americans are not just less religious than their parents, they're also less likely to return to religious practice as they age, breaking a pattern that held true for previous generations. The COVID-19 pandemic permanently altered how many people think about gathering in large groups for any purpose, religious or otherwise. And the ongoing urbanization of American life continues to weaken the geographic communities that sustained traditional churches. Yet history suggests that reports of religion's death in America may be premature. American religious life has experienced multiple periods of decline followed by renewal. The Great Awakening of the 1730s and 1740s revitalized religious practice after a period of declining church attendance. The Second Great Awakening of the early 1800s coincided with westward expansion and democratic reform movements. The evangelical revival of the 1970s and 1980s occurred during another period of social upheaval and cultural change. Whether America is experiencing another temporary decline or a permanent transformation remains an open question. What's certain is that the changes we're witnessing represent more than just shifting religious preferences. They reflect fundamental changes in how Americans relate to their communities, their neighbors, and the institutions that once bound society together. The story of America's disappearing Main Street churches is ultimately a story about community itself. For over 2 centuries, these institutions served as gathering places where Americans across lines of class, education, and political affiliation came together weekly to share common rituals, support each other through life's challenges, and work together on shared concerns. As these institutions disappear, we're conducting a vast social experiment. Can American democracy and community life survive without the social capital and civic engagement that churches traditionally provided? Some communities are already providing answers. In cities and towns across America, new forms of community organization are emerging to fill the void left by declining religious institutions. Community gardens bring neighbors together around shared environmental goals. Neighborhood associations organize block parties and advocate for local improvements. Tool libraries, time banks, and skill-sharing networks create new forms of mutual aid and cooperation. Makerspaces and community workshops provide gathering places for people with shared interests and hobbies. These new institutions often succeed by focusing on practical needs rather than abstract beliefs, by embracing diversity rather than requiring conformity, and by operating democratically rather than hierarchically. They represent evolution rather than replacement, adaptation rather than abandonment of the human need for community connection. Yet it remains to be seen whether these new forms of community organization can generate the same levels of social capital, civic engagement, and mutual support that traditional religious institutions provided at their peak. The early evidence is mixed. While some communities have successfully created thriving secular alternatives to religious community, others have experienced increased isolation, decreased civic participation, and weakened social bonds. The implications extend far beyond individual communities. Social scientists have identified strong correlations between community engagement and everything from mental health to economic prosperity to democratic participation. Communities with higher levels of social capital tend to have lower crime rates, better schools, more economic mobility, and more responsive local government. If the decline of religious institutions leads to broader declines in community engagement, the effects could reshape American society in ways we're only beginning to understand. Perhaps the most profound question raised by the disappearance of Main Street churches is whether America can maintain its sense of national community without the local communities that traditionally sustained it. The United States has always been a remarkably diverse nation, held together not by shared ethnicity or ancient traditions, but by shared values and common institutions. If those institutions continue to weaken at the local level, can national unity survive? The COVID-19 pandemic provided a preview of America without strong community institutions. In places where churches, civic organizations, and local businesses had already declined, the social and economic impacts of the pandemic were often more severe. Communities with strong institutional networks were better able to organize mutual aid, maintain social connections during lockdowns, and coordinate recovery efforts. This suggests that the stakes of America's institutional decline extend far beyond religion itself. We're not just losing places of worship, we're losing the social infrastructure that enables communities to function effectively during both normal times and crisis periods. The question isn't whether Americans will continue to believe in God. Polling suggests that most will. The question is whether Americans will continue to believe in each other enough to maintain the communities and institutions that democratic society requires. As we've seen throughout this exploration, the disappearing church on Main Street represents both an ending and a beginning. It marks the end of a particular form of American community life that sustained the nation for over 2 centuries. But it also marks the beginning of a search for new forms of community connection, adapted to the realities of contemporary American life. The outcome of this search will likely determine not just the future of American religion, but the future of American democracy itself. For in the end, both depend on the same fundamental requirement: the willingness of individuals to come together in common cause, to support each other through difficulties, and to work together for the common good. Whether Americans can maintain these traditions without the institutions that once sustained them remains one of the great unanswered questions of our time. The empty lots where churches once stood serve as both monuments to what we've lost and blank canvases for what we might yet become. The next time you drive through a small American town, take a moment to notice what stands at the corner of Main and Elm Street. If it's still a church with a thriving congregation, you're witnessing something increasingly rare: a community that has managed to maintain its traditional institutions in a rapidly changing world. If it's an empty lot, a converted brewery, or a for-sale sign, you're witnessing the ongoing transformation of American society. But either way, you're seeing a community grappling with the fundamental question of our time: how do we maintain human connection and mutual support in an age of increasing individualism and mobility? The answer to that question will shape not just the future of American religion, but the future of America itself. This has been another deep dive from Professor Archive. If you've made it this far, you're clearly someone who appreciates the hidden stories that shape our world. What did you think of this exploration? Have you witnessed these changes in your own community? And what do you think the future holds for American community life? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from the archives of history. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep uncovering the truth behind the headlines.